So with that, to dive into the legal landscape that's emerging around us, the IP and the regulatory landscape, we have Kimberly with us today. Kimberly serves as a co-founder and co-leader of Husch Blackwell's Psychedelics and Emerging Therapies practice group. As a former life sciences researcher, Kim utilizes her ability to understand and explain complex topics to advise clients as to regulatory and legal liability issues. As a dedicated problem solver and an advisor on regulatory compliance, Kimberly is passionate about guiding innovators and medical professionals through the complexities of bringing groundbreaking therapies to market. Her work is fueled by a commitment to explore the transformative potential of psychedelic therapies in addressing intractable mental health disorders, including PTSD. And she feels privileged to provide legal counsel as these innovative therapies advance through the clinical trial stages. Kimberly, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And it's such a privilege to be in this room with everyone to discuss one of the most interesting topics to ever occur in my career, and that's psychedelics. So let us just dive in. Here's just a brief overview of what I plan to cover, the intellectual property landscape, just some basics. There's a lot of nuances here that I'm just going to be giving a high-level overview about patents in the psychedelic space, as well as trademarks that will come up eventually, because there's a lot of confusion between this and cannabis in terms of trademark law. And we'll discuss a little bit about the regulatory pathways, FDA clinical trial issues, as well as what's been developed in the clinic, and a brief mention about second-generation psychedelics. Okay, so you've already gotten some background with Karen. I imagine you're here because you already have a bit of a background about psychedelics. They are substances like LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca that are gaining renewed interest as potential treatments for mental health conditions, as well as physical conditions, as we'll be discussing later on in this talk. And Karen mentioned briefly in her talk as well. So primarily they're being studied for effectiveness in terms of anxiety and depression and addiction, especially in PTSD. And this is a very exciting year. We're probably, hopefully, going to see the first FDA decision, one way or the other, about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of PTSD in August. And one of the big reasons why these are being looked at, despite the historical stigma against them, is because we have a very underserved market for the mental health crisis that's been ongoing, and especially has been exemplified during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, but as other people will be covering, there's legal challenges ahead, and a lot of money needs to be poured into it to bring this into the mainstream medical market. And so lots of folks who want to invest are also concerned about protecting their investments and also getting returns. And so how we typically do that is with intellectual property rights. So there's a growing industry presence. There's over 80 companies that are currently researching or otherwise looking into psychedelic assisted treatments of some kind, whether it's therapy assisted or not. And there's an increased demand in investor interest in this area. So as you can imagine, I state in here that studies indicate psychedelics are effective, and that's actually up for debate, right? I'm not trying to say that they've been cleared by any means in the United States. They have not been, but they are being studied quite a bit, and that's going to be covered later on in this talk about just how many clinical trials are ongoing currently in the United States involving psychedelics. Some of the psychedelics have gained breakthrough therapy status with FDA, which is very difficult status to obtain, and it's only given to drugs of very high promise that show great promise in clinical trials for unmet medical need. Right now, the psychedelic drug market is, well, this number is a little outdated. It might be a little different now. The time I pulled up this number a year ago, it was estimated to reach 10.75 billion by 2027. And there's some controversies over the intellectual property laws because of, as has been previously mentioned, that many of the psychedelics that are being trialed or being investigated are tied to indigenous knowledge. And there's a lot of reasons why to not patent something that has been used by another culture for hundreds of years, if not longer. So anyway, there's an ongoing patentability question with some of these substances that I will touch upon briefly. Because I know we're addressing a public audience, just some folks in the audience already know patent protection and what that's about. So patent protection is usually the gold standard. People want to get patent protection for their invention. It has 20 years of from the date of which your patent application as securing exclusive rights for your psychedelic assisted, well, not necessarily psychedelic assisted therapy. It could be psychedelic, period. So I'll get into that a little bit later in this talk about how some folks in the industry are trying to avoid therapy or trying to find drugs that have greater efficacy where perhaps therapy is not needed. So the three IP rights I'm going to cover are patent protection, trademark branding, which is what your brand identity is, interstate commerce, as well as trade secrets. The trade secret thing, you might think Coca-Cola, the formula, for instance, it can last forever, but you have to keep it secret. So in terms of trademarks for psychedelics, there are no federal trademarks allowed for illegal substances. So, and that might be obvious to a lot of folks, but we start coming into the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, and there are a lot of reasons why they don't allow trademarks that would encourage illegal substance use. And so you might say, well, what about cannabis? And all those trademarks that you see for the cannabis industry, as Karen mentioned, it's a state by state issuance for the cannabis industry. And so you'll see trademarks for cannabis companies that are limited to that state. You still have to defend that trademark in that state, but we have nothing, as Karen mentioned, we have nothing in terms of that allows even Oregon or Colorado to have their own trademarks within that state. So at any rate, that's it for trademarks in terms of substances. You might see a trademark for other things, and I'll touch upon that later, for instance, for digital therapeutics, things that don't actually touch the substance itself. So in terms of patents and patenting your psychedelic related discoveries, there's some concerns, and this touches a little bit on second generation psychedelics. There's been some folks have been trying to patent vast libraries of molecules that have very similar chemical structures to the known psychedelics. So they have similar tryptamine backbones, for instance, and they might seek to patent up to 125 million molecules, for instance, and it's in application. And there's a couple of them out there. And so it kind of brings to mind of like, well, how well do you have these, how well are these molecules characterized such that you can pass the enablement of that. So your patent application has to be clear enough that somebody else who's skilled in the art can actually follow your patent and actually recreate it, for instance. And so it has to be specific enough in order for that to happen. And what I'm not touching upon will be on the next slide, is that psilocybin is a naturally occurring substance. It is not a new chemical entity, and you cannot patent a natural substance unless you modify it a great deal. So you might know that Compass Pathways, a big player in the psychedelic space, has patented a form of psilocybin and the crystalline structure. So they did not patent the drug itself. They are patenting its crystallization. And so that patent was granted, and it was challenged after it was granted in a post-grant challenge, and it survived, surprisingly. And I haven't caught up with it since that time, but nevertheless, it is a controversial area, this whole patenting psychedelics and substances that are already known in nature or by a church, for instance, or by a culture. So, but you can, I don't know what happened. Okay. You can patent method or the formulation, but you just can't. So this slide kind of goes into the prior slide where it discussed, you can patent synthetic derivative psychedelics that have unique benefits over the natural counterparts. You can also patent things like new salts or crystalline forms or prodrugs. And just so you know, a prodrug is the best way to do as to explain a prodrug is through the example. So psilocybin is the active ingredient in magic mushroom. It's actually not active until it sleeps in the body and becomes psilocin. Patent infused psilocin, for instance, in your patent, saying it's for quicker, shorter effect, that's greater efficacy, greater absorption. That's another thing you can patent REMS. So as Karen mentioned in her talk, REMS is a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. It's kind of controversial. There are REMS patents out there. They actually are a safety program that the FDA usually works with the sponsor, the drug sponsor, to create. So, for instance, which is esketamine, which is a little different than racemic ketamine. There's an R and S form. But the S form is what's been patented by Janssen Pharmaceuticals. Is it working now? Oh, thank you so much. Okay. By Janssen Pharmaceuticals. And they have a REMS, a pretty extensive REMS, which includes a registration of the patients and registration of the doctors and so forth, as well as a tracking for adverse events afterwards. You can patent elements of a REMS component. It has to be specific. It would still have to be specific enough in order to pass an enablement so that somebody of the skilled in the art can practice the patent. So it can't be too general. So one thing that Compass Pathways, again, has patented, or they attempted to patent, was set and setting. So that's things like soft furnishings or the type of music you're listening to. You can probably actually patent the type of music you're listening to if you could tie in that type of music that you're listening to during the trip with a good outcome. You probably could. It would have to be specific though. It can't be just general. Theirs was too general. So it was challenged before it became a patent, and they went ahead and they're proceeding. They removed those claims, so they're proceeding without a set and setting in their patent. So that's just one way, and there might be other people in the space who are going to attempt to patent a REMS. We shall see. So I'm going to touch a little bit about the regulatory pathways for psychedelics. So in addition to FDA and the DEA that Karen mentioned in her talk, I just wanted to highlight the FTC, and that FTC is the Federal Trade Commission that prevents people from making false and misleading claims about their products. And you may think like, well, still, psilocybin is illegal. Why in the world would that happen? And it's not being used in interstate commerce, even in those states where it's legal. But it may come up in, we get this from different clients who are trying to be in the psychedelic space without actually touching the drug. So we're talking digital therapeutics for the most part, and apps or databases, if you're trying to database any kind of data from your client population, for instance. And then in which case you should probably worry about FTC and making any false or misleading claims about your product. So in terms of the clinical trial process for Schedule I substances, as Karen mentioned, both the DEA and the FDA have internal protocols for researchers that want to study Schedule I drugs. There's even a web portal that the DEA has created for those who want to study psychedelics. But just to be clear, and just because it's open to the public, just because it's being studied in clinical trials does not mean it's been cleared or that it has a recognized medical use. It's just being investigated. So here are some emerging opportunities that are what we're seeing in the clinical trial space. So this graph is from information from clinicaltrials.gov database, which shows a great rise up until, I don't know if anyone can see the bottom, it's only to 2019, this graph. So as you see, there's like hardly any studies, and then it shoots up like you would not believe. And a lot of this is is due to the fact that there's a great stigma against psychedelics. There has been no federal grant money until fairly recently available to study psychedelics in humans. So we are now seeing a considerable number of clinical trials that involve psychedelics up to now. And I'm going to cover that in this next slide. This slide is from 2023. And as you can see, there's roughly 250 clinical trials. This is a pie chart of everything and all the different substances that are being investigated in clinicaltrials.gov as of late 2023. And as you can see, about half of them involve psilocybin. And so the top three, psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD, are known to have very long effects, that is, acute effects. The subject would have to stay in the clinic or in a medical setting where they're being monitored for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 hours. And then you go into substances like DMT, 5-MeO DMT, that have much shorter acute phases. So the conditions being investigated are things like, most of them are actually being basic science studies, because the mechanism of how psychedelics works is still under some debate. I can get into that later about the 5-HT2A portion of the serotonin receptor, but I won't do that now. But for the most part, they're being looked out for depression, PTSD, so mental health disorders, as well as behavioral health disorders. But you will see here that there's a number of just physical conditions being investigated, such as Lyme disease and stroke, diabetes, and what's maybe not a lot of people know, maybe a lot of people, maybe you guys know because you guys are interested, is that psychedelics seem to have a profound anti-inflammatory effect. And so some clinical researchers are investigating that. As you might imagine, there's some design issues to try to create a truly blinded clinical trial with psychedelics. While it's possible to have a trip while you're on a placebo, it's pretty unusual. So most subjects are aware of when they've received the control or they've received an active drug. And that actually is going to inform expectancy bias, which clinical researchers are very concerned about, and how you're going to prove efficacy if you have this bias in your study. And so the other problem, there's many problems, but like the other thing to consider in your clinical trial design is that it's not necessarily objective. So you're relying on self-administered questionnaires that, how does a participant feel? What are they experiencing? Any visual, audio disturbances? Any emotions are coming up for them? And the observers can actually record what they're observing, but neither one of these is not quite the same as an objective measure. Like if you're in a cancer study, you could measure the size of a tumor shrinking, for instance. That's a much more objective measure, arguably, than these kinds of studies. But this is what we're working with, and it's just a challenge that has to be addressed. Anyway, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So I would like a show of hands of anyone who's been to the Psychedelic Science 2023 Denver conference last year. Oh, excellent. I'm glad there's a number of people. So you probably remember when the FDA draft guidance for psychedelic clinical trials came out. It actually came out June 23rd, which was the second to last day of that conference. It was an amazing conference for many reasons, but this just seemed to put just an emphasis on the whole proceedings. It was a whole week discussing psychedelic science. And then now we're talking about FDA actually coming out with a draft guidance. And what are some of the things that they're looking for? So for instance, you may not need to have your typical animal toxicology because a lot of these substances have been studied in humans for hundreds of years, for instance. So if you don't have any history with your substance, then you will have to show that animal toxicology. But they were suggesting in their draft guidance that it may not be necessary depending on the substance that you're investigating. They also wanted a functional activity. They wanted to see activity at 5-HT2B receptor. So I'm not going to get into the details about, okay, I will get into details a little bit. So it's widely theorized that what's causing hallucinogens and the active site for the psychedelics such as LSD, MDMA, and psilocybin is the 5-HT2A portion of the serotonin receptor. So just so everyone knows, there's serotonin receptors all over your body, in your gut, in your heart, in your brain, lots of places. So in addition to that, there's a 5-HT2B receptor that's also part of that serotonin receptor that seems to also be activated by some psychedelic substances and has been known to actually thicken and part your heart valves and cause, and I'm going to mess up this term, it's cause heart valvulopathy. Okay, I tried that as best I could. And that's a thickening of your heart valves, and then your heart won't work right. So I do caution people who talk about microdosing. We actually don't know what microdosing will do to your heart, for instance, because you're not feeling a psychoactive effect visibly. It still may be doing something to your heart. We don't know. There's not enough studies out there yet. So that's something that's being emphasized in the draft guidance, as well as looking at the pharmacokinetics of an oral psychedelic with high fat meals. The FDA wants you to look at that. They would also like you to work out where there's any drug-drug interactions. A lot of the population that's being where the psychedelics is being sought for use SSRIs because there are depression patients. And so right now, a lot of folks have to undergo kind of a complicated removal off the SSRI before they can even go in the clinical trials, because we just don't know the drug-drug interactions. How safe is that? So, and the other things to worry about that they point out in their draft guidance are inactive control versus inert placebo. Inactive control is something like they were hoping that people could consider using that in their clinical trials, such as niacin, for instance. It's a B vitamin, been known to cause a body flush. And so people feel like they're on something and they're not sure what that is. And if you're psychedelic and naive, that maybe you don't know what that is, and it would, at least kind of mask some of that expectancy bias. And the other possibility that I've seen is possibly using a smaller dose of the same drug, and then seeing if there's a delta or significance value between your treatment populations. And this is a little bit more that goes into the clinical trial design issues. And it has to do with, and I'm just going to back up a little bit. I probably should have done this to begin with. And I left the slide out and describe psychedelic assisted therapy. So a psychedelic assisted therapy, typically what's been run in clinical trials for MDMA assisted psychotherapy, is that the participant is reclining usually on a bed, usually has like a blanket, and usually has eye shades on, usually has a headphone on with music, and there's usually 2 monitors in the room for the entire acute phase. So we're talking 8 hours, and they just don't want to let that person alone in case there's an adverse event. So the 2 monitors can take turns about who is sitting with the I don't say patient, with the participant. So this clinical trial design challenge, FDA not only wants to continue having 2 monitors, but they want to have those 2 monitors have certain educational levels, and which can be a challenge because there's not enough mental health care providers as there is. And so there's been a little bit of comments that I've heard about this, about, what are we going to do about the shortage of mental health care providers? And you keep wanting to you want extended, so they, for instance, want factorial design study, which means for those studies that involve a therapeutic component as well as a psychedelic component and a placebo component, they want all of those areas teased out, which is going to put a demand on these clinical trials in terms of even more therapists being involved. They also wanted the therapists that are in the room during the administration of the psychedelic to be different than the therapists that are during the integration sessions. And just to give it to back up a little bit more, what's been trialed with MDMA is about 42 hours of psychotherapy. So even the control group gets that. And it's very intensive, and there's a lot of therapy involved. And so in the case of MDMA, for the phase 3B clinical trials, they saw 70% of those on MDMA no longer qualified for the diagnosis of PTSD after only 3 treatments. But the placebo group was also high. But it wasn't as high as 70. 70% is really high. Placebo group was more, I believe it was like 43%. It's a lot of therapy. So, and that's going to have an effect. So they were saying in their draft guidance that they would like to see more of that, which is, puts a strain on everyone. I don't know if everyone knows, but just so you know, clinical trials can cost like $1 billion. They're pretty expensive. Okay, we're going to talk briefly about second-generation psychedelics. So second-generation psychedelics are being widely looked into. I put this under the umbrella because of psychedelics in general, because they typically have similar backbones. They're trying to hit the same receptors as the classic psychedelics are hitting, but what they're trying to do is hit those same receptors without causing hallucinogenic effect. The idea is that they're more convenient ultimately and safer if the patient is not experiencing a hallucinogenic effect. It also reduces stigma. We're talking about new chemical entities for the most part, whereas psychedelics is fighting a almost 40-year plus stigma against them. So there's a lot of reasons why people want to go into secondary psychedelics. They're easier to patent, is another big reason. But as you might imagine, this causes some debate. Can you go ahead and eliminate hallucinogens? I mean, everyone thinks that that's great. I mean, maybe not everyone thinks that's great. I should take that back. Not everyone thinks that is great. It could be potentially great, or at least more acceptable if you're taking a drug that doesn't cause an hallucinogen. But it may be necessary for, the therapy. Okay, so just as by way of background, there is some people that believe that mystical experience that you experience on psychedelics is integral to the therapeutic impact of that psychedelic, that you can't separate one from the other. But lots of folks are pointing to the Janssen Pharmaceuticals Spravato example that was approved in 2019, and that's S-ketamine. So that's S-ketamine that was approved for the treatment of suicidality and treatment-resistant depression. And there's no therapeutic component involved with that. So lots of folks would love that. They're actually Janssen Pharmaceuticals. Spravato is, I believe, geared to be like $1 billion drug now. It's been out since 2019, so it took a while and it's pretty expensive, but nevertheless, it is actually pretty, it's taking up a huge portion of the marketplace and considered a success by many people. So it's just also, there is the idea of scalability. So if you don't need a therapeutic component, the idea that you can treat many thousands or hundreds of thousands more people more easily, perhaps at home, outside of the medical clinic, is very attractive. And that maybe they don't require, maybe these new psychedelics will not need an extended period where you have to be in the clinic for 8 hours. If it's a shorter duration and it's still effective, maybe you could take it at home, right? So these are being investigated. So, and this is a unicorn. We don't know that maybe taking the mystical trip out, maybe taking the trip out, maybe it's a myth. We don't know. There's not data that shows taking the trip out will still mean you'll have an effective, you will get all the other long-lasting effects that we see with MDMA. So, for instance, I only bring up MDMA because that's the one that's completed both phase 3A and phase 3B clinical trials, and it has a long-term effect that I believe it's 18 months later. Most of these folks that have no longer qualified for PTSD still do not qualify for PTSD after a limited dosage under their clinical trial protocol. So some of the controversy that we'll just briefly touch upon is whether it's not just neuroplasticity was the theory, right? Because there's a lot of drugs that cause neuroplasticity. I can't say that word either, such as cocaine. But no one here is going to be arguing that cocaine causes this mystical experience. I don't think. Maybe we can talk after. But that's the fact that there's probably a learning experience that goes on, and maybe that's why it's so long lasting. And so Dr. Gould Dolan, who now is at UC Berkeley, she published a seminal study in Nature that suggests the psychedelic experience is actually critical, opens up a critical learning period. And then folks they may or may not remember. I didn't remember when she told us this, but a critical learning period is period when your brain is at a plastic state and can learn a new skill. For instance, talking. Apparently, if you don't learn to talk by a certain age, most people don't learn to talk at all, right? Because the critical window is no longer there. She posits that perhaps psilocybin opens up a critical learning period. And then if you're, going through intensive therapy and you're relearning this relationship to your trauma or to yourself, for instance, and that's perhaps why we're seeing longer lasting effects, because you're relearning something. And I don't know. Okay, well, I am done.
Kimberly, thank you so much. That was so insightful, so specific. I loved it. I think it also explains why a lot of times if you ask a lawyer a question, the answer is it depends, because there's so many specific rules and regulations and little things that can make a huge difference. So thank you so much for highlighting all of that, Kimberly.